Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining in. There'll be a few others to join in as they log into to this webinar. Before we start, in the spirit of reconciliation, Parks and Leisure Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their lead elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So good morning again. My name's Nicholas Matthews. I am a senior civil engineer and I look after the Queensland office for SPORTENG, and I also sit on the Council for Parks and Leisure Australia Queensland. So we're very pleased to have the support of our regional sponsor SPORTENG, along with our national sponsors GLG, Syngenta, Otium Planning Group and Christie. So this morning's presentation will go for about 30 minutes. And then following Jarrod's presentation, I'll invite questions from the floor, and we'll have about a 20-minute Q&A session with Jarrod about delivering projects with or without a design and construction approach. So I'll ask everyone if they have any questions during the presentations, please punch them into the message box and I'll keep a follow of them. And then at the end, we'll bombard Jarrod with a few queries. So today, PLA Queensland and SPORTENG, we're very pleased to have combined forces to facilitate this event. Design and construct contracts are not an uncommon delivery option for field of play projects. D&Cs suit some projects and fields of play better than other delivery options. However, like all options, comes with shortcomings that need to be known and suitably addressed. So this morning, we'll learn from SPORTENG CEO and Director Jarrod Hill about where D&Cs work well and what other options are available. So a little bit about Jarrod. Look, as one of Australia's leading field of play designers, Jarrod blends his civil engineering profession with his extensive knowledge for the development of sport and recreation facilities to ensure client and stakeholders' desires are met. He's well known for his accomplishments in the planning and development of fields of play. And Jarrod's experience includes athletic tracks, hockey fields, football grounds. That includes all different codes of football and general multi-purpose facilities. His credentials are based on the knowledge of specialist engineering applications and a detailed understanding of athlete and venue owner requirements. This proficiency has been seen Jarrod work on most of the major sport projects throughout Australia in recent years. So with that, I'll now welcome Jarrod to our virtual stage. And if you do have any questions, please do post them into the public forum here and I'll keep track of them now. Welcome, Jarrod.
Morning. Thank you, Nick, and thank you everyone for joining in and taking some time out of your morning to tune in. I know there's some people across the country in different states. I'm down in Victoria. I see some people down in Wollongong. I see Kirky in Wollongong, and obviously some Brisbane people. So thank you for taking time out of your day. It's given me an excuse to iron a shirt for the first time in a long time, but I have sort of got used to doing these presentations and only having to iron the front top half of my shirt, so the back of it, my sleeves are all nice and crumbled because you're not going to see them. So as Nick said, I've had 17 plus years in as a design consultant. I'm a civil engineer by trade. For the best part of 15 of those, I've specialised in the designing a field of play, so anything externally that you compete on, but I also have worked on a lot of major stadium projects. Prior to my sports stuff, I was a land development consultant. I've worked on large major infrastructure projects. So while a lot of the commentary will be around, I guess, the field of play in recent times, a lot of it is still applicable, whether it be to a major highway project or a sports element. So it should be applicable to all walks of life. So thank you for dialing in. Hopefully it's, it is a dry topic, but hopefully we can, I can spice it up a little bit and hold your attention for the half an hour. So I guess what I'm hoping to get out of here is give information to you guys is helping select a journey for you. A lot of them people on the call are clients, and so I'm keen to give you an understanding of some options you have. Now, I'm not pro or negative D&C. I definitely think there's a space and time for the use of it. So don't think I'm coming in here with a jaded view on D&Cs. I think they've definitely got a place. I've worked both sides of the equation, where I've been a designer within the D&C team. So there's definitely some bonuses there. So I guess I'm bringing this from a perspective of sitting on both sides, and give you a bit of I guess what I've seen work and what hasn't worked over my journey. So what other methods available? As I said, I've been exposed to a lot of traditional methods, so the normal construct-only contracts, D&Cs, but on some of the larger stadia projects, they've had some different modes of delivery projects. So I guess the most common one, which often is referred to as construct-only, is your design, bid, construct, which I'll talk about in I guess is the base case comparison to D&C. But obviously the design, bid, construct is the three phases where the project is designed, goes out to market to tender, and then it's constructed. D&C, obviously self-explanatory in the sense that the design and construct is engaged by one sole entity, and there's risks associated with the design now moving across into that realm. Then you sort of got some mixes of those two key ones. You've got design, negotiate, construct, which can sort of be an extension to the D&C, where there's a negotiation, whether there's been design up front or there's design at the back end, that there is a negotiation phase prior to signing the contract. One that's most commonly used on some large, mainly structural projects, is the design, novate, and construct, where there's a desire to have an architectural component led and defined in that design phase. There might be 70 to 80% of the designs taken up, so you can get that architectural influence on it, and then the design team is novated over the contractor, and that final 20-30% is finalized in conjunction with the contractor, who can then bring his buildability smarts to the table. So you're getting the client's desire from the aesthetics and blending that in with the knowledge of the builder. And then you've sort of got some different changes that you've got design, construct, maintain, which I think is a great model, because it does keep the contractor accountable after the fact. So if there's any concerns with anything, you by lumping in the maintenance at the back end, they have to maintain the element they've built. So it really does put some accountability on them. And then you can start adding things like the finance on it, and the operational. So Perth Stadium, for example, was a design, construct, operate, maintain, finance. So it was a large consortia that is looking after all those components. I don't think they're fully financing it. It was a partial finance, but they're operating it for a 20-year period post-build. So, and there are other ones in there. You've got ECI, early contractor involvement, which are probably more geared to more larger infrastructure and larger structural projects. So there are a range. I'm really going to concentrate on the first two, being the design, build, and construct, and the D&C, because they're what we're more commonly used to. And I guess there's two components, which is not surprising to any of this. There is the design, regardless of which way you go, there is design required. So whether it gets done by the contractor or it gets done by a consultant, there is the design, and not surprisingly, there is the construct. So there is the two commonalities. You can't avoid them. If you want them to be built, you need to design. If you want it built, you obviously need to construct it. So wherever you go, sometimes some people forget the fact that their design sits there regardless of which way, and obviously the construction is a given. So from a design, bid, and construct, or the construct only process, as I said, there's three defined clear phases, where you've got the design, usually undertaken by a third party, and that might be a design engineer or a planner or an architect. And then there's the bid phase, so that package of drawing specification goes out to the market. You can then compare apples with apples, and then obviously it gets built by a different entity. So you've got the clear delineation between the design and the construction. And it's clearly articulated in this type of org chart, where you've got the client, he's got two contracts. He's managing the consultant and sub-consultant up front, generally, as the initial design phase. And then you're looking at going to tender and engaging the contractor. Sometimes there's a third piece of the puzzle in this relationship, where you might get an independent superintendent involved to manage what can sometimes be the referee in the boxing match between the consultant and the contractor. So that sometimes is another overlay to consider. Again, I don't like a lot of words, but sometimes we do need to put them in paper. And the traditional approach is the design, bid and construct. That's what we're generally most times, at 9 times out of 10, everyone's more commonly aware of. As I said, this design and construction is separated. The key component here, and this is a key element, is the risk remains client side. So the design risk, so not the whole project risk, there are other elements, but the design risk sits with the client. So the client engages the consultants, so the risk is sitting on the client side, not the contractor side. So that's a key difference between the two, which I'll touch base on later. One benefit is during the tender phase, you are comparing apples with apples because all the contractors are bidding on the same documents. So they've got the same drawings, the same specification, and hopefully the same bill of quantities. And then you can compare apples with apples. If it's designed right and there's a bill of quantities, there should be the known quality outcome. So they should be able to visually see in the drawings what the outcome is. If you've got the right consultant team involved, you should see your outcome on the paper. And as I said, a bill of quantities gives you some known quantities. So that gives you some known quality, known quantities, and hopefully that gives you a bit of clearer definition of what the budget's going to be at the start of that project before you go out to tender. You get a quantity surveyor involved and you get that costing done. Unfortunately, like a lot of things, poor design will lead to variations claims under this contract. So if there's gaps in your design, if there's haven't addressed site issues, there's grounds for the contractor to state claims of variation. And as I said previously, having a third-party independent involvement, whether it be a superintendent or a superintendent's representative, helps to get in between those parties, warring parties potentially. What is required for a very generalistic, detailed site investigation? Cannot stress that enough on any project, regardless of what it is. Geotech, survey, ground contamination, and then there's all the planning overlays. So making sure you know your site and that as a result, if you know it, your consultants know it. And then hopefully that all gets wrapped up into a design that addresses it, which then goes out to the contractor as a detailed design documentation, so the drawings and a technical specification, and ideally a bill of quantities. Bill of quantities is sometimes something that some consultants and clients steer away from. A bill of quantities should only be supplied in my opinion, in this environment, as an ability to quantify the project, but it's still a lump sum contract. It's really supplied for information purposes only. And what that helps the client and the superintendent at the latter stage, if there are variations, you've effectively got a shopping list of what the rates of those elements could possibly be. So yes, there's some more work involved from the consultant side of things, but as long as you clearly articulate that it's provided for information only, it does provide you with some knowledge and ammunition, if you like, at the latter stage during the tender evaluation. Sorry, not tender evaluation, variation evaluation. And as I said, one of the key elements is superintendent, whether that's the client themselves or they get a representative on board. So stepping through a D&C, simply put, the design and construction is delivered by one single entity. So that bidding phase that was there previously is now it happens obviously prior to it, but you've got that design and construction being undertaken by one entity. So there can be a lot of efficiencies in that space as a result of that. So simply, again, nice, easy outlook. Client, contract, one contract to manage, if you like, one throat to choke. So the client then has the direct line to the contractor, and then the contractor manages his team beneath there. So it'd be either internal designs or external consultants, subcontractors, suppliers. So it's a nice streamlined contract, if you like. As I said, it's a single entity that delivers the project. One single entity means one single contract. So a lot of simplicities in that process. You do transfer the risk to the contractor. So previously, as I said, in a DBC, so a design bid contract, construction contract, the risk sits client side because they've engaged the designers. So when you transfer the design over to the contractor, the design and the design risk now sits with them. So you are moving that scope across, that risk across, and as a result, you generally do pay for that risk, because when the tender is pricing on the job, when the contractor is pricing on the job in a D&C, they don't 100% have a confirmed design. So they will factor in a little bit of that risk for themselves because they haven't gone through that process. The more simpler the build, the less risk there is, obviously. In this instance, where you do want to do your due diligence, and I can't stress this enough. I sometimes laugh to myself when I see a tender submission, a tender schedule come out, and the client's asking us for our 5 previous projects. We're always going to put our best projects forwards, and the contractors are no different. I think do your due diligence, dig a little bit deeper, and ask some questions around the industry just to see how they have gone, because they're never going to show you the ones that didn't go well. And sometimes you just need to understand how they have how they've gone in a bigger spectrum of projects. In this instance, poor scoping from the client will result in variation claims. So if you've got to be really ironclad in the way you describe what you need. So because before in a design, bid and build construction contract, you got the drawings and the technical specification, which clearly articulates and visually shows what the design intent is. So you've got details, you've got interfaces, that's all clearly picked up in the drawings. In a D&C, you've almost got to articulate that through words. So there's some things you can do around standards, adhering to sport governing body requirements or what it might be, but it's a lot harder to get your scope across. So you got to really make sure that if you've got reference design drawings or performance-based specs, that they clearly articulate, because if they're not, there will be variations there. So what is required, similar as a DBC contract, you've got a detailed site investigation, geotech survey, contamination, etc. I said, clearly define the scope of works. If you're wanting a gold class finish, you need to almost say, I want a gold class finish. Because if you say a high quality finish is very subjective. So a contractor will still give you the functionality under a D&C, but the quality may drop off as a result. I said, strong reference design and performance-based specifications. Again, your reference design drawings are really going to be holistic. They're not going to get down to the macro details, so micro details. So you need to make sure the performance-based specification and some of the wording really articulates what it is you're after. So strong communication and understanding, especially the understanding during construction phase. If you don't know what you're dealing with, a good contractor will find ways to give you the same functionality as I said to, but the quality may be slightly less, obviously, because a cheaper alternative. So if you don't understand what you're dealing with, make sure someone in your team or an external body involved understands, because it makes it a lot easier in not only the communication, understanding variations, but also for the contractor, so that they're dealing with someone that they knows what the final outcome is. As I said, probably the same for both projects, having an ironclad contract. I guess 5 key components I want you to consider when you're looking at which way you deliver your projects moving forward. So project schedule, are there any constraints around project schedules? Are there any delivery milestones that need to meet stakeholder consultations? Because that sometimes dictates the outcome. Who owns the risk, whether it stays client side or if it sits contractor side, and by risk, again, the design risk. The budgets, are there any constraints? Do you know what that is? As I said, the risk, if it moves to the contractor, there will be a bit of a price there, but you're probably paying for it the same way. Design complexity and quality, I'll link them together. Sometimes they can be separate. So quality is a key one. If you've got an architectural finish or you've got a real desire to have certain elements to the specific outcome, make sure you articulate that through the drawings or verbally in words in your specification. Design complexity, sometimes one method suits the other. And client expertise, said previously, if you don't know what you're building, it makes it very hard for the contractor to understand what they need and what the outcome is. But also coming back the other way, if there's variation claims, if you don't really understand the works that's been undertaken, the contractor might find a way to exploit that. So just talk through those 5 elements for each of those for, again, comparing a DBC contract and a design and construct. So the advantages under a project schedule, the advantages for project schedule under a DBC contract is you've got a formal process. So if you've got some stakeholders that you need to meet with, you've got design reviews from multiple parties inside council or inside your clientele, you've got the concept design development contract. So you've got that process to step through, which really is looking at reducing risk, knowing everything about it, firming up budgets. So that is an advantage. I guess the disadvantage could be seen as an advantage. There are potentially stakeholder consultations, which just obviously throws a cog in the works. So if you can do that separate prior to the design being undertaken, that helps. From a D&C perspective, the huge benefit from a project schedule is the ability to potentially accelerate the works. So if you've got someone who does this, it's their bread and butter, the complexity is low, it is something that they do on a frequent basis, you can almost get an overlap between the design and construction. So while they're finalizing their design for your sign-off, they can start doing work on site, some site clearing, some site prepping work, drainage outfalls, some of the water supply type things. So they can actually start speeding up that process. I guess the disadvantage, if there is any, there is limited design reviews. Most contractors in a D&C they've shown you their tender design. They've only really factored in a final design for your review. There's not going to be multiple goes at it. They've priced it based on the scope of work that you've given them. Once they've shown you their tender, there really is only going to be one more design. They say, here's your final, this is what we're building. So you do lose that ability to get multiple reviews if that's something of want, which may impact the schedule. And as I said, if there's any delays due to poor ground conditions, incorrect briefing of the project, that they will put delays on the project. So that's from the project schedule sense. From a risk perspective, as said, the key thing here is, where does the risk sit? Does it sit with the designer and the client side, or does it sit with the contractor? So the advantage for a DBC is you've got third-party designers, so their insurances are on the line, so the risk sits with them. Ideally, in that process, you do get the approvals done during the DBC, so there's no delays potentially if you go out to D&C without those approvals sought. And it allows for a detailed tender assessment because you've got a bill of quantities, you're comparing apples with apples. So it makes that component a little bit easier. From a disadvantage side, as I said, the risk sits with the client. Now that may or may not be a risk, but that is, a disadvantage, but that's where the risk sits in this environment. And you need to ensure you're engaging the right consultant to undo these works. So if the risk sits client side, you want to make sure the designers and planners, architects get it right the first time. Because if it goes out and there's errors, as I said, poor documentation will result in variations. From a benefit in the D&C realm, as I said earlier, one throat to choke. So from managing a contract, you've got one point. If there's a design issue, if there's a site issue, if there's a construction issue, you can go straight to one point. You're not having to go between different parties and saying it's a design, it's a construction issue. You've got one point of call. So that makes that a lot easier. You're transferring the risk. As I said earlier, you probably pay for that. But if you've got a site that is low risk or even high risk and you're not sure how to deal with it, you can park it with them. If you've got the right documentation, it should reduce the claims because there's no finger pointing between the contractor saying it's issues with the design and the other way around. So it should reduce claims. If there's any disadvantage of it under a risk perspective, is the lack of design control. You do, as I said earlier, you can only show so much in reference designs and only articulate so much in a performance-based specification. So you do lose a little bit of the control and the finishes around that. So that would be a consideration of disadvantage to that package. From a budget sense, I've probably touched on it already. From a DBC, by the time you've gone through the design, you hopefully got a well-detailed bill of quantity. You've got a QS price set up. So by the time it goes to market, you should have a very good understanding of your project costs. At the time it goes out to tender, because everyone's pricing the same bill of quantities, looking at the same drawings, you are comparing apples with apples. I guess the disadvantage from the contractor's point of view will be that sometimes us engineers and designers and architects overcomplicate it. We do things that are sitting there and just going, so you're paying for more, and a contractor might see that as value management, which is great because then you're getting it back, but potentially you're not getting the buildability advice that, and as a result, you're over designing it, which then costs. On the other side of the fence, the benefit from a design and construct is potentially for them to bring their buildability advice to the table and simplify some of those interfaces, some of those key components to minimize some of the costs and identify those savings. I guess from a disadvantage, when you go to tender, it's very difficult to know what the cost is going to be. You'll have a QS will base it on previous projects or might be basing it on a square meterage, but you don't definitively know where you're sitting. So it could be plus or minus 1 or 2% or could be more. So that is a disadvantage. As I said, you are paying for the risk. How much of that, it might be small, might be minimal, might be more, but the fact that you're putting the design over there, the contractor hasn't 100% finalized their design. So they need to factor in a little bit of fat in their price to allow for finalization of design, but any minor changes that might impact their output. A lump sum contract, it's not so much a disadvantage, but as long as everyone's aware that in a lump sum contract, there are still triggers for them to hit back on latent conditions or other issues associated with poor documentation. And as I said, in a D&C, if you don't get the performance-based and reference design right, and you ask for design changes, that will potentially come with time and cost implications. So if in your mind you had a gold-plated finish, and again, you don't articulate that, or if you wanted a certain interface at the fence line or at the building roof line, if you don't clearly articulate that, the contractor will look at the functionality of their solution, and they will deliver it accordingly. So, which may be different to what you've got in mind. So then you've got to go back and say, I didn't envisage that. This is not what I want. So if you don't have grounds to push back on it, it will be cost and time constraints. From a design complexity and quality, I guess a design, bid and construct, it's a formal process. As I said earlier, it becomes a known quality because you can control it. So if you want that, come back to that gold finish, that interface, what it might be, certain type of door, detailing, you can put that in your drawings. As a result, you can readily control your quality. You go through a QA process internally with your QS, and you can tweak it, you can change it, you can go from pine to mahogany to whatever surface change might be, and you know that when you go out there. The disadvantage of a DBC, sometimes us consultants just don't understand the buildability. I've seen it time and time again. Looks good in drawing, but when it gets out to be actually built, it's very difficult. Sometimes consultants try to stretch their abilities and draw something that's not buildable. So you lose that buildability advice, and that's strong. That's a strong advantage of a D&C, is you get that buildability advice. They will tell you frankly what is built. What they put down in the drawing will be the most efficient. It may not always be the most aesthetically appealing sometimes, but it'll be the most functional and most efficient way. You can get their specialist input, because if it's depending on the type of project, it's their bread and butter. I guess from a disadvantage, there can be reduced quality by cheapest route selection. So again, the functionality will be there. So your D&C say, I wanted a roof, and they'll give you a roof, but it might be a tiled roof, and you were envisaging corrugated iron or something. So you need to really articulate what it is you want. Otherwise, they'll give you the functionality at the cheapest outcome. So the lack of design control, you're handing it over to the quality to some extent to the contractor, unless you've really put a fence around the quality in your initial documentation, in your reference design and performance-based spec. As I said, you're highly reliant on your words in your documentation. So if you wanted copper finishing, if you want brass finish, whatever it might be, you wanted the Rolls Royce, you need to articulate that and where it actually occurs. So you need to really be clear in where those elements occur. And finally, from a client side, the expertise, a lot of times I've seen clients not understand what they're building, not understand what they're having built for them, and contractors, they can sniff that away, and that's just good business. They can find ways to make again, the functionality work, but the outcome quality might be reduced. So from a DBC perspective, you're heavily reliant on the design consultants. So again, that can be a positive and negative. If you get the wrong people, they can be putting the wrong outcome there for you. And to some extent, it requires less knowledge because you're engaging directly with them, and there's a journey from the start of the project to the design, going out to tender. So they are informing you and bringing you up to speed. The disadvantage is you've got to make sure you get the right consultant, and sometimes we'll make mistakes and hit the wrong place. So we need to make sure you get the right people on board. And unfortunately, it happens in a DBC. You get that finger pointing between the designer and the contractor, and often the client is sitting in between, either as the superintendent or they've got a superintendent's representative. So you need to be sometimes battle hardened in that space and not get bullied by one party or the other. From a D&C perspective, the advantages are you've got access to the contractor knowledge and experience. So you from your side, you can go, okay, I'm getting the guys, this is what they do. They build these things all the time. This is their speciality. That's great. But still, it still requires some level of knowledge from the client side. Otherwise, you are taking them for their word, which 9 times out of 10, they're all decent people, same as consultants. But that 10% of the time, they may find that avenue to get more variations out of you. So having some knowledge, if you don't have the knowledge with yourself, someone in your team or externally, is key component to a D&C oversight works. So I guess the question is, is it to D&C or not to D&C? That I'm a firm believer that it's horses for courses. It does work. What I've learned along the journey is, who is managing the risk? Is it the client? Does the client want to manage the risk, or is the client happy to move the risk? And how is it risk? So from my perspective, if it's a simple build, the risk can sit either way. There is no real benefit in one way or the other. If it's a complicated build, there's merits for both ways again. Do you want to make sure you get to the end of it? It's a sloping site. You need to really work out how it's going to build. So you take that risk on. So when you go to the market, you're comparing apples to apples, but you've de-risked that. If you go to the market with a heavily sloped site with a generic description of how you want it to work, that risk gets moved over to the contractor. And as I said, that the cost will be incurred by the project in that space. So understanding the risk where it sits is a key element. Quality control and finishes. There's a huge, as I said, I presented this to the Victorian PLA probably 5 or 6 years ago, similar topic, when there was a lot of D&Cs in the sport and rec realm that were, you can see the substandard quality of finish. Now the surface was great, everything was working, but some of the finishes, particularly around the perimeter of the infrastructure, you see spoon drains and those things which were not really efficient in their functionality. So it worked, the function worked, but the quality was a little bit lacking. So if you're happy for it to be functional is the main driver, then a D&C is a great outcome. If you're wanting special attention to certain finishes and quality of different interfaces, you do need to put a bit more time in the design components. Contractors are fantastic. If you get the right team on board that know how to build these, they can make your life a lot easier. So they do have the capability. Some of them have the in-house design. So in a D&C, you're not worrying about them having to get a third party involved. Sometimes they've got the in-house ability. So that works really well in that space. A man's got to know his limitations, whether it be the client needs to understand that they do or don't know what they're working at. A contractor who tries to design something based on it's always worked this way, not referring back to an Australian standard or an engineering principles. You need to know where you're sitting at. And same with the designer. You can't design something that's not buildable. So between those three, there's a relationship between the client, the designer, and the builder that needs to be understood, and whether it suits best as a D&C or if it sits best as a DBC contract. Regardless of which way you go, and depending on the scope of the contract, there needs to be strong client-side representation, whether it's a third party acting as a superintendent's representative. Just helps manage some of those contractors. So if you go down a DVC contract, it becomes a referee potentially between the two warring parties if there are issues, or if you go a D&C, a well-versed and well-knowledgeable superintendent rep can help you review variations and those type of things. So where does it work? I think it works really well in simple projects. So an example for that would be a hockey pitch replacement. You don't need a detailed design set of drawings, specifications for that. It's a simple bit of work. You want a performance-based specification and some reference design drawings that show the extent of the work and articulates what the work is, and that's a nice, easy one. Where does it work? If you're really compressed with time, if you've got a hard and fast set date, D&Cs can really help work well. Ultimately, you're probably going to pay for the risk, as I said, and a slight reduction in the quality, visual quality of it. But if you're pressed for time, a D&C will help that work. If it's the contractor's bread and butter, D&Cs for roads are fantastic. That's their bread and butter. You don't really worry about the aesthetics of a bit of asphalt and some concrete curbing. You're worrying about the functionality. So in that space, D&Cs on roadways are cherry ripe. When you're on a greenfield site with a slope with some complexities and the risk is a little bit higher, there's an argument to say either way that it might be better suited to go through the design consultation, especially if you've got stakeholders that you need to walk through. But if it's a contractor's bread and butter, often a D&C works well. As I said, low visual quality outcome, roads a prime example. All you need is a flat top, curbing, and you got the quality. It's a functionality, more or less around the quality. And if the client's got strong expertise, so if they've got in-house client expertise that understands the whole design and the construction, it works really well in that space. Where doesn't it work? I think sometimes the complex projects, sometimes push the in-house capability of a D&C contract and then requires them to get a design consultant on board anyway. So when you get to that and they're having to bring a third party involved, you're almost better to just go through the process internally and work through the issues and then go out to the market. If it's a building, you can get a loss of architectural vision. So again, if you wanted the Taj Mahal and you wanted certain finishes, interfaces, fittings, a D&C probably doesn't work in that space. If there is, and it's, again, similar, if there's a strong visual aesthetics. If it's high risk, if you push high risk onto a D&C contract, you will pay for it. And by high risk, if there's contamination, sloping site, those things, and that may be fine. You know, that may be the ultimate. I'm a strong believer that a project will cost what it costs if it goes either way. Sometimes it's how you get there. If you've got the right design, you've got the right builder, you can get there. So if it's a high risk, it may or may not work in a D&C sense. And flip side to what I said before, if the client doesn't have a lot of expertise, D&Cs may or may not be the best outcome. I've seen too many times where it's probably gone pear-shaped, and the final outcome may not be what the client was hoping for. So in conclusion, I guess I think D&Cs, there is a place for them. I'm not against them. I think it is a horses for courses. It really comes down to a conversation between quality and project risk. If you're wanting a high quality outcome and you're wanting to manage the risk, well, that sits with a DBC contract. If you're happy to lower the quality potentially, and not so much around that, it's more around the visual quality, I guess, but the functionality be there, a D&C is probably best suited. A D&C really requires strong reference design documentation. So you need that strong reference design drawings that articulate visually what you're after in a holistic approach, because you're not going to really be able to dive down to the details, and then a really strong performance-based specification to support that. Ensure the client has adequate representation, knowledgeable representation. So whether it be a third party or internally, having that knowledge in-house really makes that D&C work well. And I do like, as I said earlier, adding maintain to a D&C contract, because it just keeps them on their toes. Because if they have to take over what they've built, generally speaking, you know, there's no corners cut, because if there's any issues, they're the one that's going to have to pay for it during that maintenance period. So it's an easy thing to add on, because it does, generally from a field of play perspective in particular, there is a big maintenance upkeep. But you know, if you put it into that space, it does keep them honest, I guess. So thank you. That was sort of my presentation. So if there's any questions, I've been lucky enough to work on a lot of projects along the journey. So if there's any questions, I'd be keen to have a chat.
Yeah, thanks again, Jarrod. And you're welcome to drop some comments into the comment box on the side. Paul dropped in a comment there, Jarrod, just to sum that up there, that for D&C contracts, at times the risk does still sit, the long-term risk still sits with the client. You know, for example, the performance and the environmental outcomes overall, which don't become apparent for a number of years, sit with the client. What's your thoughts on that, Jarrod?
Yeah, I mean that's where you're going to. It comes back to the risk sitting with the design risk sits with the client, but ultimately the project risk, I guess, sits with the design risk sits with the contractor, but the overall project risk sits with the client. So if you do get a substandard installation, whether it be irrigation, a poor performing profile, you're not going to see it in the first 12 to 18 months. It will be down the track. So you know, Paul is right. The overall project risk does sit there, and it comes back to having that need for the strong client representation that understands the limitations understands their limitations and how they can support that through either third parties or in-house overseeing of it.
Yep. There's a few more questions coming through. I'm happy for anyone to chime in and unmute and ask questions if they want.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the one from Martin there. Are there any construction standards? I mean, the sport governing bodies provide a direction around the performance of those profiles. So whether it be natural turf, synthetic, acrylic, running track, there are performance requirements. There are some dimensional requirements. They fall short on the performance requirements of the long term in regards to the pavement longevity. They do sometimes provide some direction on the drainage rate. So the sport governing bodies are definitely a starting point to give you some direction as to the performance requirements of the surface. When it comes to the longevity of the pavement, those things you really need to probably look at discussing it with an engineer or the contractor themselves with in-house capacity to understand. Australian standards do dictate. I see some drainage suppliers that might put certain size piping in which don't necessarily comply with Australian standards, but it has always worked rule they roll out with. So I think getting third-party certification or at least sign off from an accredited designer sometimes take some of that risk out of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. So another question dropped in there, Jarrod.
That's a good one, Megan. How do you advise if the design is done well? That's a very, I mean, you go to the consultant or the D&C contractor on the basis that you're getting the design that suits your outcome. The only way you can really guarantee that there's the design's done right is to get that independent certification. So Queensland does have a lot of the drainage and some of those things that require certification by a chartered engineer. So that does cover you to some extent. The sport governing bodies sometimes have the in-house to run an eye over it, and that is really it, is just running an eye over it, making sure runoffs, surface gradients, those things. So it is a hard one, Megan, to really define, particularly in the sport and rec field of play space, that there's not a lot of directive with some of the sport governing bodies on is a design right. So it's peer reviews are always great to do a sanity check. They don't cost a lot to get a third party just to run their eye over it and run the ruler over it. Sometimes you run the risk of getting some bravado in there and they're trying to rip apart another designer's work. So you want to step carefully there. But again, the sport governing bodies generally have relationships with designers they can talk to have a third party peer review.
Good question there from Stephanie. Jarrod, in terms of a D&C contract, do you have any thoughts around providing a budget value in the tender documentation?
I'm a strong, Steph. I think I'm a strong advocate of letting people know what the budget range might be. Obviously, you don't want to show your hand fully and say we've only got $10 million and that's all you've got. But to give them a range, it gives them an understanding of the level of quality as well. So if you're saying we're expecting a range of 200,000 or 300,000, it gives the contract a bit of an indication on the level of quality. It does, some people will be against the idea of sharing that much intel because it does remove some of the competitive nature. Go, oh, actually, I can go up there and because you can still get the functionality and put a price tag on it. So it really telling them how much they can spend and not giving them enough detail around that functionality. They'll go, okay, they want a roof. They've only said I want a roof, and they've told me 200, 300,000. That's great. I can price that, but then I'll give them a tiled roof. And in your mind, it might have been you wanted a corrugated tin roof or something more aesthetically poor example. But it's a hard one. I can't stress enough making sure that your design verbally, if it is a D&C, or not verbally in the specification, clearly articulates. If there are any details, you can still zoom in on those, and photos. Said picture tells 1,000 words. So I guess in a DVC contract, you might have 30 drawings, that clearly articulate hopefully what the visual intent is. Where the reference design, you might only be looking at 3 or 4. But if you've got some visual photos, you can include them and say this is the expectation of the finish at some of these key areas. So the more you can put in there, it just gives them a clear indication.
Yeah, next good one. Can you elaborate, Jarrod, on what you mean by a performance-based spec as opposed to a standard specification?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I guess we see a performance-based specification is it's more around what you're telling the D&C contractor what they need to be. So it's all around the performance requirements for a pavement. So it might simply be a 20-year life cycle that can hold the surface tolerance. And it might be a materialistic requirement. So you might say I want to be a rigid concrete pavement or a flexible one. You put some parameters around the performance of the irrigation system. So I know Paul's on here. You might want a certain efficiency, certain coverage. So you're putting a fence around it. So you're not saying I want a natural turf oval. You're saying I want a natural turf oval with the ability to drain at 100 millimeters per hour with an irrigation system that has a uniformity of whatever it might be, 98%. Good luck to you if you get that. But it's really putting a fence around it and not being so open that they can come and say, oh, they want a natural turf oval. I can get it growing, but during winter it doesn't drain, and during summer it's as hard as a rock. It's putting some of those performance criteria around there. So versus a technical one where you're pretty much telling them exactly what they want. So with a performance base for a pavement, you're saying I want a 20-year life cycle. For a technical, you're saying it's got to be made out of this crushed rock, class 2 crushed rock with this type of materials, and you're much more specific in the material effectively so you're not telling them the performance, you're telling them the materials they got to use.
This is a good one, bit of a discussion point. In terms of a D&C contract, for us to get better design control, could we not then incorporate more design development reporting phases between the contractor and the client in a D&C, or does that defeat the purpose of a D&C stretching that timeline? Sorry if I'm mishatching these questions.
No. I think that's a good question, Kat. That is definitely a way to do it. What clients generally do in that space is probably get an ECI, so an early contractor involvement involved. So you go through your normal DBC, but you pay a fee to a contractor to come in and provide constructability advice through that design. So you could definitely do a D&C there. I wouldn't say it's common to do that approach, but to get early contractor involvement in is definitely something you can do. So you still go a traditional DBC and you bring a contractor in that just does a couple of peer reviews, joins in some workshops, and you can still go through that process. So I guess there's nothing stopping you doing the D&C with a staged approach. Some contractors might go, listen, I'm not buying into a 4-month design process. My extent of my input is really, I want it, a 1-month design at max type thing. So it could be done. I'd probably look at getting an ECI involved and get the contractor involved and doing some spot checks and some advice. I see Rob Kirkwood on the call. I'm sure Kirky gets calls all the time on advice on how to build things and those things. So the contractors are there for advice as well. They want to share their knowledge to make sure when it comes out to them, whichever way it is, it's buildable. There's nothing more frustrating from a contractor to have a set of documentation they look at and go, what they're asking is not buildable for the price that they're asking. So most of them are more than open to provide advice during that design phase.
We've probably got time for the last 2 questions dropped in here. Rob put one in there. Jarrod, what period would you suggest for the client to allow for the design approval process in a D&C contract following award?
Yeah, that's a good one, Kirky. I mean, if you go down the D&C path, there's got to be an expectation that the design phase is not going to be your traditional. You're not going to be sitting there for 3 months going through the typical staged approach. So, if you're engaging a D&C, you're pretty much saying, here is your contract for the design and construction. As I said in presentation, you're really only going to get probably one good chance to really thoroughly review post their tender design. So they'll always internally they'll create a design which they'll issue as part of their submission, so that they get an understanding of where they're pricing it, so they can show the client this is what we've allowed for. But beyond that, in their minds, there's one more design check, and they take that on. They've won the job. Like that's it. They've won the job based on that reference design. So my expectation on D&C is that there's probably one more review in there, and from there the contractor wants to start building. If you start drawing it out, these contractors are booking these projects in. So if they win a D&C, there's an expectation internally they're going to start within the next 4 to 6 weeks on the ground. If you draw that out, they're going to have kit sitting around going, well, we can't put that on another job because we've allocated it here. So from a client perspective, if you delve into a D&C, there's got to be an expectation that they're ready to go. They're programming their guys, their kit or their subbies ready to go. So you can't delay that design period.
And the final question there from Ed: in a design, construct, maintain contract, how long would you recommend the maintain period run for?
As long as you can, Ed. I mean, as Paul said, sometimes you're not going to see the issues until year 5, year 10. So there is a benefit of locking them in up front, because you do lock them in a competitive space. So as part of that design, that contract, initially you're getting competitive maintenance rates as well. So I would have thought, depending on the surface, a minimum of 3 years is a good feel, because you'll start to see if it's a synthetic product, you'll start to see some
either delamination, some issues there, seams falling apart. If it's a natural turf, well, you'll probably see it in the first 12 months, to be honest. So I think 3 years is a good figure. And then, any longer is probably, you probably struggle to get anyone to sign on for that much longer.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Jarrod. Unfortunately, I didn't hit the record button on this. I saw a good question there, whether we can send the recording out.
No, I think it is recording. I've got a recording on my side, mate.
Oh, fantastic. So, okay,
no,
there we go.
I think I'm the host, so it is recording. Yep.
Okay, I'll just drop a message there for Martin. Brilliant. Well, again, thank you, Jarrod, and also thanks to SportEng for supporting and co-hosting this webinar this morning as the PLA Queensland Major Region sponsor. Thanks everyone for also participating and joining in on this discussion. I hope you've all found this webinar valuable and getting to hear Jarrod's insights about why D&Cs do suit some projects and fields of play better than other delivery options. And then also, as we got to see there, the shortcomings and the benefits for each of these different types of contracts. PLA Queensland will provide a copy of this presentation, and thankfully, yes, it is recorded, so we'll send that out as well shortly. It'll be within I believe there's a libraries webpage on the PLA website, but if not, I'm sure Chris or myself will share a link to make that easy for you. Good news is there's 2 more webinars planned for PLA Queensland in conjunction with SportEng. So the next session is on the first Wednesday next month, Wednesday the 6th of October. That's where we will have Troy Fiscus present on irrigation design for Australian sport and recreation areas. And then the third webinar is on the following month, on Wednesday the 3rd of November, where Pat Beasley is going to present on transforming spaces for Australian sport and rec areas. Details of these other webinars will be provided to you through other PLA events and on the webpage. So please do check your inbox later today. We'll send out a participant feedback survey, and again, we really encourage that feedback. We want to help the members and any others that are interested in joining PLA as a member to make sure we're getting the value that you want to hear. So thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you.